What makes it a great crash is whether or not you pile in by borrowing a lot of money. Oh, by the way, when economists say great, they mean the opposite. So the Great Crash of 1929 led to the Great Depression.
Linda Yu is a professor of economics at London Business School and fellow at Oxford. She's written a book called The Great Crashes, Lessons from Global Meltdowns and How to Prevent Them.
Of the 10 great crashes I write about, half of them happened in this century. And sometimes think, yes, our challenges today are formidable. However, if you look back at history, you can see what's possible.
Your book looks at like the 10 great crashes,
Yeah.
big ones. There's hundreds of mini crashes along the timeline.
Yeah.
Why do we get crashes?
It's a great question because I think a lot of books imply you could prevent the next one. And my own subtitle says, lessons from global meltdowns and how to prevent them. But let's be really clear. It's to prevent it from becoming a global meltdown. It doesn't prevent, nothing can prevent the next crisis. And the reason is actually FOMO.
Yeah, okay. So
Fear
it's
of missing out.
an emotional thing.
Yeah. So let's talk about AI, so artificial intelligence, right? So is it fundamental or is it a bubble, all the money that's gone in? And of course, I write about the dot-com bubble, which is the 1990s equivalent. Oh my God, you could buy something on the internet and not have to go to a physical store. Is it fundamental or is it a bubble? And if you suffer from FOMO, which everyone does, it's human nature, you are going to pile in. And that is why you always end up with these financial, bubbles. And if there's a bubble, there's a bust. And that's actually why we always have financial bubbles. And not all of them become great crashes, but the regularity of financial bubbles is just down to human nature.
Because the promise of the dot-com bubble kind of delivered just 20 years later than everyone bet. And people bought a load of crap along the way, didn't they? That was the problem, Because if you look at this idea around the 90s of, I think there was a quote in Wired at the time that was like, we're about to see a 25-year explosion in productivity that's going to, double economic output. And if you look, they were right. There was just this massive dip because of the exuberance. You look at the common features that every crash has.
Yes.
One of them is that kind of exuberance. You said it's hard to tell if something is fundamentally rising in value as a bubble or a crash, but you always point to debt as one of the reasons. Can you just explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so the dot-com bubble is a great example of irrational exuberance. That's actually when the term was phrased. So another way to think about FOMO is you see something and you think, wow, Bill Gates just said AI is going to fundamentally transform. And so therefore you feel exuberant, you feel euphoria, you feel like I need to be part of that. So that is the first phase of all great crashes, because you can't crash unless you have a bubble. However, what makes it a great crash is whether or not you pile in by borrowing a lot of money or debt. So if your piling in is financed through lots of leverage, through lots of debt, then when the bubble bursts, you may find that you can't repay it. And that's actually why my suggestion in the book is we will always be subject to FOMO because it's really hard to tell. However, just don't pile in with too much debt.
The '08 crash would be an example of a speculative bubble that was fueled by debt, but this time it was property, right?
Yeah.
The idea that property would always go up would be the exuberance.
Yeah, so I read about Japan, and there was this feeling that Japan, remember, had the biggest real estate crash in the early 1990s. But there was just this belief that property prices can ever only go up. And then the banks got involved, they lent money, and now you can see where the story headed, which is you borrow a lot of money, you yourself can't repay it, and now you've borrowed it from the banks. Now the banks are in trouble because what they lent against, the collateral, has lost its value. So now when you drag the banks down, then a banking crash, which is among the worst financial crises, those tend to be great crashes. And we don't even have to look that far. We can look at, if you talk to your friends and colleagues, here, house prices is one of the most common topics in the pub or, over dinner, over lunch.
Yeah.
What do you think is going to happen to the housing market? Surely with all the supply constraints, they can only ever go up. So I think, we are all, party to this.
What makes a banking crash so bad then?
So if you look across history, banking crashes are among the worst because they affect the real economy. So if we look at the dot-com bubble again, so the dot-com era were characterized by companies that probably were just ahead of their time. So one of the stories I tell in the book is, when you have a wall of money coming in, why wouldn't you spend millions on a sock puppet and put it in the Supertime halftime show? I mean, you got millions. That was Pets.com, the most famous collapse. Or you spend millions building a 3D website when most people still had dial-up modems. Like, you remember those? Dring.
It makes that noise like a fax machine.
The phone, Mom.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to get on the internet. So they were like creating like 3D websites. So they probably were ahead of their time. So that's actually one of the lessons. But the point is the wall of money didn't come from banks in the dot-com era. It actually came from venture capitalists. And so it didn't actually, at the time, the investors in the stocks weren't doing so by borrowing money. They weren't investing on margin. And so that means that it was still a spectacular crash. I mean, the NASDAQ, which is a US tech index, didn't recover until 2015 after it crashed in 2000. That's 15 years. However, ICT was a smaller part of the economy and the banks weren't dragged down with it. So if you look at other crashes, like the financial crisis from just over a decade ago, when the banks lend the money, and that often happens with housing crises because they own the mortgages, then when the banks rebuild their balance sheet, so that as in, oh my God, my collateral is worth a lot less, I can't lend. The regulators are telling me I have to pull back. When they pull back, it creates a credit crunch. A credit crunch means that other people who running businesses or want to borrow mortgages, they can't access money. So if you can't access money, the credit crunch means the economy as a whole is impacted. And that's the difference between, say, the dot-com bubble crashing, which caused a pretty short and shallow recession, and the financial crisis from 2008, which caused a decade of a slow recovery as the credit crunch and banks rebuilt their balance sheets and everything worked through the system. And so throughout history, banking crashes lead to some of the worst economic outcomes. Unemployment goes up, the economy obviously goes into recession because there's not free, money, which was fairly freely available, isn't there. So in the book, I write about a banking executive who said to me, banks are so used to being able to access money from financial markets. He goes, it's as if your whole life you turn the faucet on and one day just nothing came out and they thought they broke the system. And so that's actually why banking crashes are the worst.
In your book, you mentioned the Great Depression and that the Fed started to bail people out, but then they stopped and it was like premature withdrawal and it caused more problems because they didn't get the faith back in the banks. Could you say a bit about how FDR, you said he fixed it in like a day or a couple of days by saying, trust the banks, guys, it's safer than the bed and all that stuff?
I know, it's an extraordinary story, isn't it? So that's actually how I start the book with the Great Depression of the 1930s, which was triggered by the 1929 Great Crash. And the three phases of every crash that I write about actually comes from the Great Crash of 1929, which has a special place in the history books. Oh, by the way, when economists say great, they mean the opposite. So the Great Crash of 1929 led to the Great Depression of the 1930s. So what you saw was exuberance. Think about the roaring 20s. Commercial aircrafts, getting automobiles, consumer goods. People piled into the stock market going, wow, this is roaring, it's called the roaring 20s for a reason. However, they did it with debt. So when it crashed, the banks were brought down.
10 times leverage, wasn't it?
So huge,
Yeah.
absolutely huge. And then you just had widespread bankruptcy. So the second phase of every crash is how you resolve it. Third phase is the aftermath. So FDR was instrumental in the resolution of the crisis, but the aftermath was so bad, and that was because of policy mistakes. So going to how FDR did it. So FDR, imagine you win the US election. You are now president of the United States. So your first day in office, your team goes, oh, by the way, you've got a month-long bank run. People are just pulling their money out of the banks. It is, you've got to. So literally over a weekend, he closed all the banks and then he shut the stock exchange. And he did his famous fireside chat. You guys appreciate this because you're podcast hosts, where he did a radio broadcast and he spoke to Americans directly. And he said, we have sorted the banks. Only the sound ones will reopen. So believe me when I say that it's safer to put your money in the bank than under your mattress. So then come Monday, there were queues outside the banks. But to their great relief, it was to deposit money.
Yeah, not to withdraw anymore.
Yeah. And so he was credible. And so that's the trait.
I think he said that was the biggest day in the stock market in American history after that.
Exactly. When the stock market opened, again, it was the biggest one-day jump to date at that point. So why was he so credible? So he acted quickly. He did something his predecessor couldn't do in 3 years. Because this is now, by this point, we're looking, it's 1933. It's been miserable since 1929. However, he was backed up by deposit insurance and legislation that was already in the works. So it's credibility backed up by policies that gave the confidence that the system was being, rebuilt. But why was the aftermath so bad? So when I write about the third phase, the aftermath of any crisis depends on the cause of the crisis. So that's the first phase, how much debt. Second phase, which is how credible is the policy making. So the Great Depression lasted for a decade, and it was absolutely horrible for millions and millions of people because it was a bank crash. And secondly, there were policy mistakes. So there was actually a second recession in 1937. It's called the recession within a depression. And it's because the Fed, the Treasury, they thought the economy was recovering, and then they withdrew their support prematurely. And then that triggered another downturn. And it wasn't until 1941 with the advent of World War II, that the Great Depression actually ended. And so in all the crashes I write about, the aftermath, the third phase, depends hugely on what the cause is and then the policy measures used to address the crisis. But the reason why the Great Depression holds this specific place is because it's still the model for the lessons you should draw from this kind of crisis, in order not to inflict misery upon millions of people, which obviously is something that all great crashes unfortunately share. By the way, you might be wondering why the second downturn was called a recession and the first one was a depression. So there's no technical definition of the difference for economists. A depression is just something which is significantly worse than a recession. Or in the Ronald Reagan formulation that I write about in the book, a recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose your job.
So, I thought it was a catchy name, recession inside a depression. Or yeah, it's just a catchy phrase, but that makes sense. So depressions are worse than recessions.
Yeah, significantly worse. But so trying to calculate it is pretty challenging. It's just miserable all around, unfortunately.
And then they had a war.
Yeah, which kind of dragged them out of it.
Yeah.
Like that was the catalyst to the rejuvenation of the economy, was a horrific war. It's a brutal time.
They had a tough couple of decades there.
This thing about credibility, though, like I looked into it because it was Hoover that preceded, wasn't it?
Yes.
Herbert
Hoover.
And in his inauguration or his first speech, he came out and was like, "Everything is great. We are great." And then 6 months later, the economy collapsed. And it's like there's no credibility in that man now. It's almost like you need a new leader to come in and go, "Don't worry, he's rubbish. I'll fix it." Maybe similar to the UK, it's like previous government loses any form of credibility, new government comes in, and for some, that's almost like you flick a switch in terms of people's sentiment towards the markets and things like this. So you've said that the IMF say that the first 10 months is crucial around this credibility point. So what kind of things do we do in those 10 months to stop these major economic downturns?
So one of the biggest failures is actually the Japanese. Because they took 8 years to sort the banks. And that contributed, unfortunately, to their lost decades of growth. So speed is one of the factors. So why didn't the Japanese act more quickly? They didn't feel they had political support because people were so angry about the banks. And so it's the ability to act quickly and execute, which is important. But what's fascinating, and I know that you all have tons of conversations around financial markets, is this concept of confidence, which is associated with credibility. And sometimes the example that I'm going to give you now is more recent. It's the Euro crisis. And the example is the European Central Bank President Mario Draghi's whatever it takes speech. So this is actually an example of confidence and credibility in turning the corner of the Euro crisis. So I was there in July 2012. You might remember the date because that was the start of the Olympics in London.
Oh, yeah.
And so the government put together a conference, the Global Investment Conference, because they said, all these people are coming to the Olympics. We should make the most of it. So I was actually there, and it was unfortunately 2 years into the Euro crisis at that point. You might remember all the protests in Greece, the misery caused across the Eurozone, countries being rescued, and there just seemed to be no respite from this crisis. So Mario Draghi, who's the president of the European Central Bank, he gave a speech in which he said, at Lancaster House in central London to all these, global business people and policymakers. And he goes, none of you really understand the political will behind the euro. Believe me when I say we will do whatever it takes to safeguard the euro. And you can see right after that, financial markets believed him. The spread between risky government bonds, so, Greece, rescue countries like Portugal, started to narrow vis-a-vis safe haven assets like German bonds. So I write about in the book, the U.S. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner was impressed. He went to Frankfurt, the headquarters of the ECB, and said, tell me about the speech. How did you come up with it? And it turned out that Draghi had ad-libbed it. It wasn't actually in his speech. He just stood up and said what he thought. And so there was actually nothing backing it. Later on, pretty quickly later on, Angela Merkel, the Eurozone leaders, backed him up. But they have actually been saying this for some time, which is we politically back the euro. But doing it after Draghi had made that speech was viewed as, adding to the credibility people already believed. And then eventually Draghi got, the power to do a few other things that bond markets are looking for, but he never actually used any of those policies because the credibility of the central bank and the politicians standing behind the single currency turned the tide. It didn't end the euro crisis. Unfortunately, that just continued on and causing misery for lots of people across Europe. However, the acute phase of it changed. And what I mean by that is after that, when Greek government bond yield, so that's the cost of the Greek government borrowing, shot up to like 32%, there was no contagion on the rest of the Eurozone bond markets. And so that's telling you they think it's contained. And then the Euro crisis obviously eventually resolved itself. But that was just over a decade ago. And it's an extraordinary example, I think, of confidence and why that's so important for investors.
The way businesses really make money is by solving a problem. And one of the best kind of problems to solve is one that helps a company generate more revenue. This is where our new partner Vanta comes in, because they unblock deals that would have otherwise hit a wall around proving security compliance with things like GDPR. The issue is when you're selling to a business outside of the UK, or any large business for that matter, chances are they're going to want proof that your security practices are in order. Getting that proof is a right pain, especially for ISO 27001 or SOC 2. The easy way to prove that you're compliant with these standards is by working with Vanta, because they save you loads of time and stress. So if you need to prove your security practices are in order, and if you want $1,000 off, head to vanta.com/makingmoney.
Can it be as much as one man or one woman coming out saying one line, and that is enough to stop things?
Because this echoes FDR. So like they both spoke, like he spoke on the radio, they spoke on the news or whatever, but like it's speaking to the people, and then obviously being backed up by Angela Merkel and everything else helps. But do you think it's like the initial sentiment and then having quick policies afterwards, or having policies in place or changing, but more about getting the momentum going and then building on it?
Yeah, it's that's a great point that differentiates from FDR. FDR actually had the policies.
Yeah.
Draghi just had it. But then very quickly, they put more behind it. But I think these days, financial markets, I think, are even more driven by confidence than they were. Because everything's just faster. Information flows more quickly, But this idea that you still need a credible individual, I think, and policies is absolutely why I use that as the more recent example. There's a phrase you hear sometimes in financial markets, which is don't bet against the central bank.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that's, that was really tested during the Euro crisis because the European Central Bank lacked a lot of the tools that you would normally associate with a central bank, which is why you wouldn't bet against the central bank. And so I think he had, the weight of institutions with him, as in most investors don't bet against the central bank. The ECB is still in a process of formation because it's such an unusual central bank. So, but to me, it's one of my, most, I was there. And so I remember watching the spreads come in on the bond markets and thinking, am I missing something? Was it just this? It was just a whatever it takes speech. I remember going like, "Is there something else that just happened? Something in bond markets? Wait, what's going on?" So, anyways, that's what I think is a fascinating
I think people
episode.
we respond better to like human interaction, and people like you said, he like ad-libbed it. Like people being genuine and speaking from the heart. I think it moves people.
Sounding like they mean it.
Yeah, it sounded like me rather than like, we've got
got
these numbers and this is a policy. And they're like, if you just tell them the message, then they'll trust you to run the numbers and all the financials and technical stuff. But they want to hear a clear message that they believe and they can trust in and get behind.
Yeah. So unfortunately now lots of policymakers use that phrase, whatever it takes. It doesn't quite have the same resonance. It's got to have a little bit, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. What about Silicon Valley Bank then? Because that seemed to be swift action. But I remember the sentiment of like normal investors was like, let them burn. Because they were like, the VCs, like people thought it's their own fault. Why are they getting bailed out and I didn't in the '08 crash?
Yeah. So Silicon Valley Bank is a great example of a few things. So, one is speed of financial crises these days, because the run on it was digital. And then immediately, within days, other mid-sized banks will be affected. Now, when we say mid-sized banks, Silicon Valley Bank was the second biggest bank failure in U.S. history. The only one that was bigger was Washington Mutual during the 2008 banking crash. And so when we say mid-size, I think we just bear in mind these are big banks. They're just not, and this is a point of regulation, they weren't regulated as systemically important financial institutions. It's not as big as a JP Morgan. But here's a lesson from history that I think probably should have been heeded a bit more, which is I write about the 1980 savings and loan crisis. So savings and loans in the United States are like banking associations here. They're just local, banks. They lend mortgages and things. If enough of them fail, it can be a systemic crisis. So many of them failed in the 1980s, one in each U.S. state at least. It was the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. So that is the reason why the U.S. Treasury, Janet Yellen, who used to be the Fed governor, stepped in really quickly, because if enough mid-sized banks fail, it can still trigger a systemic crisis the way that you saw in the 1980s. So what she did was to essentially guarantee the deposits over the deposit limit. So the deposit limit in the United States is pretty generous.
$250K.
Which is more generous than in Europe. But she wouldn't basically just guaranteed all the deposits. And that's where some of the, as you say, the unhappiness came from. And I think it creates what's called moral hazard, where If banks think they'll be bailed out, then they could act in more risky ways. So, history will judge the effectiveness of that, but the immediate impact was to stem the crisis. And then they found buyers very quickly, actually, to buy pieces of it. But there's lots of lessons there, including regulation. So I just mentioned this is the second biggest bank failure in U.S. history. But because it was a regional bank, it wasn't regulated to the same extent as the JP Morgans, the big banks. And so that's a lesson that if you look back to the 1980s, probably should have been heeded a bit more, which is why I make that point, which is just because they're regional or mid-size, it doesn't mean they should be more lightly regulated if they still have this risk of being systemic.
It's like taking a domino out because the dominoes are falling and spreading, and you've kind of got to remove one to stop this collapsing chain. This point that you said there about viable businesses, there's a quote where you say, don't pretend that we have policies that can prevent a crisis, but instead support viable businesses in times of a crisis. But these banks, some of them don't seem viable, or in Japan, they supported ghost companies for years. So is the financial services industry protected from that sentence, from being viable, and they just get bailed out because they're banks?
So it's a really interesting debate as to, could you ever resolve the dilemma around too big to fail? I don't think you can. I think you just do your best. But remember, all regulation is written for the last crisis. So it's like shutting the stable doors after the horses have bolted. So, but we do know that banks, there are measures to try and reduce the tendency to lend when times are good. So for instance, the way a bank lends is you give a loan on a house price goes up, and now your collateral is worth more. Now you can lend more. So the idea that you try and, I would say, it's called lean against the wind. You're leaning against that kind of behavior, I think is important. And if you regulate them, they should be going concerns. So, but like I said, in a crisis, it becomes a debate as to whether or not banks are just too big to fail. Yeah, or
that's my favorite. That's my favorite quote in the book. No one wants to take away the punch bowl when the party's just getting started.
Yeah, that's right.
Sounds like me and Damien. Never want to take away the punch bowl when the party's starting.
Yeah, so that comes from a Fed chairman in the 1950s, and that approach is why what I just described is actually new. It's really a change since the global financial crisis of 2008, where regulators will now do that, lean against the bubble,
so they're
take
leaning
away the
against
punch bowl.
The punch bowl. They're taking it away. They're trying to remove a bit of the air out of it rather than going, let's just let it go massive and burst.
And then deal with the consequences, absolutely. So in terms of supporting viable businesses, that is really challenging when banks are rebuilding their own balance sheets. And so what you also saw after the global financial crisis is that the central banks, like the Bank of England, they were offering specific lines of credit to try and ease the credit crunch, telling banks if you were to support SME, small businesses, you could access this line of credit for a much lower rate of interest. So that's about making sure that when there is a credit crunch, viable firms survive. Because lots of firms are viable, but they have liquidity needs. And so that, I think, is really important. And also to support people as well. We all know how it feels like when, your mortgage is coming up and, if you're unable to borrow because of a credit crunch, that obviously impacts, people's wealth. And so those are the things to really focus on, supporting viable businesses and households. The challenge is working out who's viable. So you probably see, lots of companies get supported, which maybe shouldn't have been. In Japan, zombie firms resulted. And so there's always going to be imperfect application, I think, on that.
A zombie firm is that cool name.
Hit a button.
Oh, yeah. What is a zombie firm? A firm run by the undead? Or is it like a ghost company? Like, how does a zombie firm work?
Yeah, so you mentioned ghost companies. So actually, we call them zombie firms in the literature because, they're sort of undead. They keep going because you give them cheap money, but they're actually not viable businesses.
They shouldn't be alive, but they're still limping along, kind of thing.
Kind of like zombies. They should be dead, but they
still
somehow are
moving
alive. Somehow they're still there, and that is a massive issue for Japan. Because if you had all the support of zombie firms, how would the banking sector ever really recover? Because now they're lending to companies which...
They stay afloat, but they're not really generating a lot of revenue.
Exactly. Then you become stagnant, which is actually the lost decades of growth. So
I think I gathered that I'm just going to guess, there's a crash every 8 to 10 years or something like that. Like every day,
probably more common than that.
A big
crash
one
in the stock market.
No, like a major,
because there's a big difference between the stock market taking a dip and
I'm talking
the economy.
big crashes, like every 10 years. Why do you talk a lot about policies, and why are the banks? I'm just thinking like a normal person. Why do the banks get to get away with this? Like every time, like they get bailed out this time, they screw the global economy another time, they mess up a country another time. How come there isn't just a lot? I heard you said about like leaning into the wind, but why isn't there stronger policies to say, okay, let's not let this happen again, and if it does, it won't be nearly as bad? Why are the policies not a bit stronger on them?
Yeah, I mean, it's so I was just thinking your point about frequency. So of the 10 great crashes I write about, half of them happened in this century. I mean, now that's depressing. Yeah. So
a bit crashier.
And it's in fact, people tell me they feel like they're the crisis generation because they've only ever known crises. So, Gen Z. You start with the dot-com bubble. You probably don't remember that if you're Gen Z, but you know what I'm getting at.
The millennials do.
Millennials, exactly.
Born in 88. I know nothing but crashes.
Exactly, right? And then you have, so that's the recession in 2001.
Graduated at the global financial crisis.
Yeah.
Got a bit of COVID.
Then I graduated again in COVID, my second graduation in COVID. So
there you go. And then there's a cost of living crisis, which is what I write about, in the book as well. So it does seem like we have a lot of crashes, unfortunately. And interestingly, we've had a lot of crashes since about the early 1980s, not really before. The 50s and 60s were known as the golden era of growth because you didn't actually have great crashes. So why is that? So in the book, I write about the fact that financial markets were not international. They weren't as developed. And then the 21st century, the transmission of loss of confidence is just faster. And also, it's not been a good century in terms of crashes anyways, like we've been saying, just lots of different factors. So sometimes it's banks, sometimes it's financial markets. So, the stock exchange, we talked about the dot-com bubble. Sometimes it's currencies. So this is the exchange rate crashes in emerging markets in Europe. And so there's a lot of different kinds of causes of crashes. As we said at the very beginning, you can try and regulate, you can try and lean against the wind, you can try and deflate bubbles, you can try and put in more regulatory requirements. But let's just take it to today. So what is the biggest risk now? Well, a lot of central bankers say it's shadow banks. So we're essentially right back to, well, hang on, now that you've put more.
Sorry, I've got to ask, what's a shadow bank?
Yeah, so I was just about to define it.
I was like, before you get to the definition, I just like to hit the button whenever I can. So I was like, let me not miss this moment.
So shadow banks, we started to hear about them after 2008 because it's like, wait, hang on. Private equity. So these are firms that are lending money using private money. So in other words, pension funds give them money, they invest it. They branched out into lending. So it's called private credit. So now you've got lending from banks without a banking license in a sense, right? You borrow money, it's your lender because you're a bank, but you don't have a banking license. So if you don't have a banking license, who regulates you?
Yeah.
Generally, you're regulated generally, but not specifically. Yeah. And so this is a great example of how, this is why I sort of did a little history. until you had this growth of the financial sector, you just didn't have this many crashes. Now, a lot of, the debates here are always very interesting, especially now where the UK is talking about increasing competitiveness, because if you have lots of startups that need cash, if you want to be in the technology sector, which requires a lot of, if you want to build a battery for electric vehicles, we're talking billions. We're not talking millions, we're talking billions. So where does this money come from? And so one argument is if you do not have a transparent way of looking at all the different bits of lending in the financial sector, you could actually dampen growth by, for instance, this is the UK debate. Why is it that we don't seem to be able to produce any major tech companies the way the US does? We're just as prone to crises, by the way. So I think there is, but I think to me, the main thing is we always regulate for the last crisis. And so when you look at the next one, the shadow banks, half of the lending in the world right now comes from shadow banks.
Wow.
So we'll use China as an example because the crash is happening now. So a lot of people look at China's property crash, and it is very worrying, obviously. Biggest property companies in China are among the biggest companies in the world, which are leveraged. So as property prices crash, Chinese people don't borrow a lot to buy their homes. Actually, their mortgages are pretty small. They save money. But the property developers borrow a lot of money, but they don't borrow it from the state-owned banks because the state-owned banks are state-owned and pretty cautious, actually. They have lots of other problems, but, so where do they borrow it from? They borrow from the shadow banking sector. So they just borrow it from other sources of money. Could be, any source of private credit outside of the banking sector. It's not all loan sharks. It always sounds like a shady shadow banks.
Sounds like something out of Harry Potter or something like out of a mob film.
Yeah,
shadow banks.
Yeah.
It's a good name.
So because we have such little information, you don't actually really know, which is actually the problem. And so therefore, you have these big indebted property companies, Evergrande, greatly in the news, pretty much defaulted on, people lend money to it. It's borrowing from somebody within China, and it's the shadow bank. So if the property sector continues to struggle, then the shadow banks could fail in the same way that a regular bank could fail. You lend too much money, you're not getting paid back, you could fail. Who else have they lent to? Well, one example is one province in China on the East Coast, very entrepreneurial. Half the companies there borrow from shadow banks. So if the shadow banks go under, those companies can't operate because they've now lost their access to credit. And then these are the people who would be losing money and therefore could crash the economy. So I think there is quite a big risk. That is actually what's happening in China. It's just that, we never hear about it. So, but it's an example.
As I'm sure you're fully aware by now, I've been using manual services for over a year to improve what's been going on with my hair. So if you look back to when I first started the podcast, you could see my hair on the sides was thinning considerably. I don't think there's anything wrong with going bald. I just haven't got the head shape for it, if I'm being honest. So, I wanted to hold on to my hair. And before I jumped to Turkey to get a hair transplant, I thought I'd try out manual. And I was really happy with the service overall. So then I approached them and asked them if they wanted to sponsor the podcast and my main channel. And here we are. The service couldn't be simpler to use. You just go onto their website, fill out a quick questionnaire, and they will send you clinically proven treatments in the post. No need to leave your house or for an appointment or anything like that. Treatments include things like minoxidil, which has loads of academic research discussing its benefits for preventing hair loss. If you want to try out manual, then use the link in the description, and at checkout use code MM55 for 55% off your first order.
How using the lessons of the past, and what kind of policy would we need to enact if that was to happen? We can't prevent it, as you've said. We'd step in.
Yeah, so I think speed and decisiveness is very important. So the first thing is to work out, taking China as the example again, they've been trying to deal with the shadow banks now for years. You need to know, you just need data, and a lot of lending is digital. as we all know, if it's digital, it's actually pretty traceable. So they have dealt with this quite slowly. Because, it takes a while to publish a book, right? You finish the manuscript, it gets sent in, and then it gets turned around. And so I was trying to write the book pretty quickly because there were so many crashes. And I was like, I'm never going to finish this book. But I also wanted to do it before the Chinese system really imploded because I was like, oh, no, this chapter's never going to get finished.
Then you could be like, called it.
But I think I was quite concerned that, obviously for China, I wanted them to sort it quickly. But for myself, I was like, oh no, when it goes to print, how am I going to update this? But my point is they've now taken so long that they're still slowly gathering the information because it's really hard to get information from, shadow banks. And so if you don't have information, how can you really credibly deal with it quickly? In other words, if you knew who the lenders were, those are the ones that you would go check their books, make sure they had, stop overextending themselves. Can they manage the loans that they currently have? Are there ways that, but that's the quickly sorting the bank's point, which is just this is the lesson from history they should have learned. I'm just not sure that it's, one, feasible, but two, I do worry that they haven't done so already that we know of.
You also talk about lack of credibility in China itself, though, and the financial reporting that comes out of there. There's another layer, isn't there, that China are not, like their GDP figures are often questioned and stuff. So how does that go into the mix of this?
Yeah, so I think if you look at how China's weathered a few crashes, this point about credibility, I think, is a real challenge for them. So, China had a stock market crash in 2015. They did have a local shadow banking crash before as well, but they haven't displayed the kinds of policies that give confidence. And so I think that is something that we should worry about. But the thing I would also say is Mark Twain had this great saying, which is history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Yeah. So what I just said is part of the story because China is different, but every crash is different. But by the way, when people in financial markets say this time is different, what they're implying is this time, don't worry, it's not a bubble, it'll be fine. When I say this time is different, I actually just mean you should never wholesale apply anything from one country or one time to another. And China kind of fits that. So why hasn't China's crash been worse? Well, they own all the banks. They have capital controls, which means money doesn't really leave the country. People have confidence in the banking sector because I think they don't have much of a choice. Everything is state-owned. So there's so many reasons why they don't fit the model. So for instance, banks, they should do what's called mark-to-market. Right. So your balance sheet should reflect the value of your mortgages, of your business loans. They don't really mark to market because China's market is a bit, imperfect. So you don't actually know whether their balance sheets are sound or not. So, and then I made a couple of references to the fact that it's hard to know what's really happening in China. So they might have massive crashes in different bits, or they could be doing a brilliant job sorting it. We're only getting glimpses, of it. However, if China were to have a great crash because of the shadow banks and this ongoing property problem, it would have global consequences.
They couldn't hide it.
No, it would have.
You say that there's a lot of fragile economies that are reliant on credit from China.
Yeah, that's actually one of my biggest worries because we do have this unusual, very unusual, where China actually lends more overseas than the World Bank, whose job it is to lend to, countries to alleviate poverty, International Monetary Fund, its sister institution. China is the biggest lender in the world, but mostly to developing countries. So some developing countries, the biggest portion of their debt is owed to China. And therefore, if China were to have a crash and it started to pull back its loans or just cease its loans, then you could see countries struggling, developing countries struggling. And given that China doesn't cooperate with, other countries in terms of how it does its lending, I worry that all the tensions you see with China and other countries means there wouldn't be a quick enough response to help those countries if China were to pull back their lending. And that could cause a emerging market crisis. We've had a lot of these with regularity, and that would cause misery for millions of people, because we talked about banking crashes being miserable. Being rescued as a country is absolutely miserable. And so, so that's one of my worries about China's crash.
Could that be a global meltdown, or do you think it wouldn't affect Western civilization as much because, America and China aren't exactly best friends? Do you think it would be more like Africa and other countries that will be affected, or do you think it would have knock-on effects for like us in America as well?
Well, it's a great question because it also reminds me of another lesson from history. So the biggest hedge fund in the United States was brought down by an emerging markets crisis. So this is the 1990s Asian financial crisis, which then spread to Russia, Turkey, Latin America, and it brought down LTCM, Long-Term Capital Management, which was at the time the biggest hedge fund in the US, which made it the biggest hedge fund in the world. So I write about this because LTCM had on its books not one, but two Nobel laureates in economics, economists that won the top prize in the subject. They had a vice chairman of the US Federal Reserve, top central banker, who quit the Fed to actually join LTCM. So despite their incredible pedigree, they were rescued by the US government because of their bets on emerging markets that went wrong. And the US government rescued them because they were concerned about the size and the reach of this hedge fund. And so they're worried about, domino effect that we've described. And so do I think today an emerging markets crisis could affect the West? Yes, for the same reason. And this is actually, a lesson that I felt is always worth emphasizing, because I think it's, you think linkages in the financial markets, but it's worth taking another look.
So you mentioned just there that half of all of the crashes that we've seen have been in the last 25 years. So they're becoming more frequent. So should we expect major crashes more often nowadays?
Yeah, I do worry that is the case because the speed of information is just so much faster. However, remember, history doesn't repeat itself. So it's really difficult when you've had different kinds of crashes, especially, and I'll kind of go through these in a sec, whether or not there's any real pattern. So in other words, late 1990s, 2000, dot-com bubble happened, and then interest rates were cut really low to support that. And people were like, I'm not putting my money in stocks. I'll just put it into housing as my other asset. Then the housing bubble, which then started to crash in 2007. So that's only about 7 years. And then 2008, it implodes, right? Global financial crisis. And then the Euro crisis happens 2 years after that in 2010. And that is in what I describe as the slipstream of the global financial crisis, because European banks were already struggling. And now they've got a loss of confidence in terms of sovereigns, countries like Ireland. And now we have another crisis. And that's just a couple of years since the start of the 2008 banking crashes. So then you have sort of a number of crashes. And this is something that happens quite a lot. They're not great crashes, but they're still pretty big crashes. I don't write about them because, you've got to draw your line somewhere. But I do write about the fact in, 2013, emerging markets had suffered what financial analysts called a taper tantrum. So, the Fed was going to cut back its money printing, and then emerging markets were really struggling. 2015, China has a major currency crash and stock market crash. Companies on the FTSE 100 here had their biggest one-day loss because of that crash since 2008. So that was consequential, but didn't lead to a recession. So I don't write about that. So now you know where I'm going, right? We're in 2015. So now you're beginning to see the recovery of the NASDAQ. You're beginning to see the tech sector really grow. And then all these, highs that were hit in 2019, and the end of the year, COVID hits. So then after that, you're like, this is absolutely global pandemic. This is causing tons of misery beyond financial stuff. February 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. Now we have a cost of living crisis. And so then October 2023, Israel, Hamas. So we have had a lot of shocks that have contributed to cost of living crisis, various things. But I think I'm kind of drawing out this timeline because I do think lots of people feel they're the crisis generation. But because these crises all come from different different drivers, still really important, I think, to learn from history and to say, well, okay, the financial consequences of this is, I can see this pattern, in every crash. But what can be quite interesting and very frustrating is that we'll take the COVID-19 crash. By the end of the year, lockdowns happened in 2020. By the end of 2020, start 2021, there were vaccines were coming on stream, which is incredible, by the way. Financial markets hit record highs in January 2021. So I write about in the book the average person, people, the rest of us, were, suffering from all the economic consequences of that. But financial markets were hitting record highs. We saw this after 2008 as well. In America, they describe it as the difference between Wall Street and Main Street. Here, I guess it would be the high street and the city. It doesn't rhyme. But, financial markets recover, but the economy does not. And this dichotomy, I think, is very, very concerning for a lot of people who think, well, hang on, all the policies that have helped, the rich get richer, and the rest of us are still suffering from the crash or the austerity.
If someone is participating in the markets, hearing about all these crashes is pretty worrying, but a consistent investment approach in a broad index over that time would have produced excellent returns, even with all those crashes, which is kind of amazing, isn't it, really?
Yeah, that's absolutely for the, what we just said about the pandemic, the S&P 500, Dow Jones, multiple highs, world MSCI or world index record high. But what's fascinating is the NASDAQ, after the dot-com bubble, took 15 years to recover. So you would have had to be an active stock picker to pick the Amazons. So if you look at Microsoft, Cisco, they struggled throughout that entire period to go back to the valuations they had at the peak at the end of the 1990s. So again, Mark Twain clearly is brilliant. History doesn't repeat itself, so different crashes generate different dynamics.
I don't know if it was in your book, but there was a quote somewhere that said, there were some decades when nothing happens, and then there were like weeks when it feels like decades have happened in like terms of technology advancement. With like the whole AI thing, and it seems like one of those things, like in the last year or so, everyone's gone AI crazy, and it's like 10 years of growth in AI in like just the last year. Do you think this is like an AI bubble? I mean, obviously you're putting you on the spot, but like, do you think AI is a bubble, or do you think it's like the .com thing where it could be like, we're not seeing the huge effects of it, but it probably will change our lives in like 5 years, but people think it's now. How do you feel?
Yeah, so I think it has a lot of parallels to the .com era because, not all the .coms are transformative. And not all AI will be transformative. But there is something about this technology which can change the way that we live. So just like in the .com era, not every company failed. There were some outstanding winners. Amazon is the example I write about. But here, I told you, we were talking earlier about pets.com. So who was the 50% owner of pets.com?
Was it Bezos?
Yes, Jeff Bezos.
Really?
So, he wanted to sell you everything, not just books. But then he invested in pets.com. But for Amazon itself, he was very focused on the bottom line. He was very focused on grabbing market share when other firms failed. So I feel like today it's a similar kind of era. So AI, seems like is the kind of technology that could be transformative in the same way the .coms did. Is it too soon? Is it too early? Very hard to say. But I think what is clear is there'll be some winners from AI. some which are, just like in the dot-com era, potentially winners, but it's the wrong business model. As with everything, it's the specific companies that I think would be really, really interesting to follow. But as a sector, it feels, look at some of the valuations around some of the AI companies. I was in Silicon Valley recently, and a venture capitalist said to me, we won't look at a proposal unless it has AI in the title. Yeah. And I was like, oh, that's not a good sign.
Sounds pretty crashy to me. Yeah. Sounds pretty bad.
I was like, did I tell you wrote a book called The Great Crash?
Yeah, time to sell. That's like the shoe shine boy story, isn't it? It's like time to get out. Yeah, I mean, it's that saying of we overestimate what tech can do in a year, underestimate what it can do in 10.
Yeah,
and I think that's probably how I look at it and think, who knows, like ChatGPT is burning cash. It might not be the thing. That's the thing that sparked people's interest, isn't it? But the AI it's been in financial markets for years, quant funds, things like this. People are using it in lots of different ways. And I don't think the chatbots, they might not be the thing that delivers all the value.
Yeah, it's a good way of thinking about it. I think Bill Gates did say that he thinks AI is the most transformative technology he's seen in his lifetime. And, that's a big statement.
Well, he was bullish on the internet and people were laughing at him. He said the same thing about the internet, and I've seen them, they were like, why just send a letter? Why would you send an email? He was like, this is a big deal.
But there's a famous call he got wrong. I'm going to get this probably slightly wrong, but I think he said something like, who'd ever need more than 64 kilobytes?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So, but that's, I think, part of the joy of writing this book is I got to write stories about companies and startups, entrepreneurs, financing, and they all they make mistakes. We talked momentarily about Gates, we talked about Bezos. And I think that is part of when a market gets frothy, you cannot separate the winners from the losers. And I think that is actually one of the lessons, to not actually, as a company, to not actually see a market downturn as, complete disaster, because some of the strongest companies to come out of crashes are the ones that, run them. It sounds so obvious, but it's actually really difficult. Run yourself well. So in the 2008 crash, I write about some of the companies which emerged are the startups that have changed today. So Airbnb, for instance, these are companies that start during a crash. And this is actually, it has a long history. Hewlett-Packard started in a recession. Lots of companies that start in a recession and actually turn out to be, if you can do well in a downturn, imagine how well you'll do in an upturn.
And they say more millionaires are made in recession at any other time.
Probably because everybody else's wealth has collapsed. And
and they're absorbing it all.
This is like the story of how Amazon started to grab, other market share. But it makes
in
perfect
COVID, how
sense.
everyone's like, Amazon's done so well. It's like, well, yeah, because no one can leave the house.
Yeah.
You mentioned something there around figureheads being wrong. And I wonder, have you noticed, you also talked about how spread of information leads to things being potentially more crashy. Do you see big personalities and their ability to reach broad audiences as like a threat or something that can lead to crashes? Cults of personality, like Elon, these kind of people.
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure that social media and the fast transmission of information has certainly accelerated, the bank crash that we discussed earlier, Silicon Valley Bank. I'm sure in terms of financial markets, it's added volatility. So I think about, China's stock market is dominated by retail investors. They tend to be swayed by, well-known figures, sentiment, and so you do, and it's more volatile as a result. And so I do think there is an element of that. I think what I find absolutely, because this book is about crashes, but obviously I write about companies and people as well. What I actually find quite interesting is the ability to fail and get up again. So, we talked about companies that, actually do well in a crash. There's also the entrepreneurs who reinvent themselves. So, for instance, the CEO of Pets.com, which is the most famous failure in the dot-com era, again, she then founded a company called The Real, which is a luxury secondhand, sales website and with stores. So I think there's a lot of great stories about reinvention, and some not great stories. So I also write about the movie Wall Street, 1980s movie with
Michael Douglas.
Greed
is Good. Gordon Gekko.
Yeah, Gordon Gekko. And so Gordon Gekko, his fictional character, is modeled on some of the people from the savings and loan crisis. One of them is Michael Milken, the junk bond king, who invented junk bonds. These are fallen angels, companies that used to be investment grade, and now they're in the junk bond, era, and all of that contributed to the S&L crisis. But anyways, Michael Milken was pardoned by President Trump. And now he runs one of the biggest gatherings of investors in Beverly Hills every year in this big conference. So I ended that chapter by saying, F. Scott Fitzgerald might have been wrong because he famously said there are no second acts in American lives. It seems pretty clear to me we're in an era where there certainly are.
Second act, third acts, and fourth acts,
You can do whatever you want and come back from it.
Which
at
is
the same time, you can be cancelled in an instant and never be seen again.
Yeah.
So this point around good things coming out of bad, in the epilogue of your book, you talk about a great reset. And I think one fascinating example, or one thing that you made me think about, was that COVID might be something that actually drives forward productivity, because working from home expands the UK economy. Leeds has become a massive hub for finance jobs because you can stretch out from, say, London. Can we talk about this great reset and the elements of that, and how you think the crashes can lead to more good things, basically?
So I write about the COVID-19 crash, and then when I was trying to draw the lessons, it's really challenging because it's not a normal crash. Obviously, a global pandemic, that's pretty scary. And so it just had different lessons that it held, and working from home, technology is one of them. And so I write about it as a great reset because I do feel like lots of people reset themselves during this period. Sometimes because you were forced to. But sometimes I think it just opened up a different way of thinking about life, right? And so technology does play a pretty big role in it. So I write about the fact that you can only really do working from home, remote working, because the technology and the business practice changed. So in other words, this is one of the lessons from my other book, The Great Economist, which is, how are we surrounded by all this technology? And then everyone tells us we have slow growth. So Zoom IPO'd before the pandemic, but it wasn't used. People didn't think it was acceptable to use it to meet colleagues, to meet clients. It's the use of technology that has enabled working from home. It's made things more efficient. You still get Zoom fatigue, of course. But the larger point is technology has become an enabler and changed the culture and expectations of work. That is a great reset for people who, used to go to the office 5 days a week, to have that, flexibility because technology has enabled it. And I think the other components of the Great Reset, which I was, fascinated by, is I think there was a lot of concern that the environment would be less important because people were focused on global health. But actually, it just made, I think, a reset where we sat back and said, yes, global health is hugely important. And so is the environment. This is a global public good. And so efforts around the environment did not really diminish. In fact, I would say they are strengthening in terms of, wanting companies to do better in terms of what we do ourselves. And then the final bit of it is a fairer society. So my previous book, I write about how, there's a lot of backlash against the existing system around globalization, lots and lots of unhappiness with the status quo. But what we saw in the pandemic was that you could use government support to help viable businesses, to support people through the furlough scheme so they don't lose their jobs because of a big shock. It creates a fairer world. And the use of, I think, I would say public funds in a different way, I think has changed the way we think about, for instance, universal basic income, UBI, this concept that, could we have a standard of living in a country, which is a conversation that builds on what we saw in COVID. So by keeping viable businesses afloat and people, even though, their companies didn't really need them full time, but keeping them employed, it strengthens not just these people's economic positions, but us as a society to not have had a big spike in, unemployment because people leave the labor market or they become discouraged or lose good companies.
You speak about environment and the risks it poses. We always go backwards in terms of reforming the regulations, but what happens if the environment falls apart?
So the next great crash, I write about China as the next great crash in my book, but I should be very clear. I was given advice that you should either predict the event or the timing, but never both.
Yeah.
So
we're
like,
all friends here.
Yeah.
So China on like July 14th.
Yeah, exactly.
What day?
But I also, I say any number of things could actually be the next great crash. The reason I worry about China is for the reasons we've already discussed, which is I think it have a significant global impact, as well as on the country itself. But lots of things could be the next great crash. And those who specialize in the environment tell me the environment could be the next great crash. We talked about shadow banking, but, those who look at insurance companies that have insured in, say, flood-prone areas or, others who have supported, properties that haven't adequately taken into account the potential of environmental shocks. Those are the kinds of balance sheets that could cause the next crisis. Whether it becomes a great crash depends on all the things that we've discussed before. But, there's a reason, I think, why companies now are reporting on climate risk as a risk in their annual reports. So financial companies report on it, normal companies as in operational companies report on it, because there is this, I think, concern that, we have environmental disasters on a pretty regular basis. So it could trigger.
I hadn't even thought of that. Like, if London flooded, the insurance risk there is.
Because there were some islands and small countries that they said they're going to be underwater in like 10
the atolls and that.
Yeah,
They just,
so like,
Maldives,
and then other places where they're going to flood more, have tsunamis or have like earthquakes. You think that something like an earthquake or flood would have happened, like a big one that would have caused some drama, like in California or London? Like if the Thames floods, we're all in trouble. We're all in trouble with the
Well, the San Andreas fault is like a ticking time bomb, right? They think that. So that would be a big payout.
And America's California's like the 8th biggest economy in the world or something.
Yeah,
so if they have a really bad one in California, it could.
But then the reaction would need to be, it's okay. We're gonna pay for that. We're going to come in and we're going to honour the insurance claims. If a whole city went out that was £1 trillion worth of insurance claims, that would be the decisive action.
Yeah, so that would, and then the consequence of that, and this is, I think, something worth, thinking. So if these insurance companies are too big to fail, then they get rescued. Then if you think about what happened after the banking crash in 2008, the consequences on the government's, budget and balance sheet means they start cutting back on other things because they have to,
and things like this.
Yeah. And so when they do that, then you have, now you have a potential great crash because now you have indebted governments and you have, taxpayers' money being used. And unlike, for instance, banks, which have bail-in other words, the changes since 2008 mean that shareholders and bondholders lose, not just taxpayers. You don't have that outside the banking sector. So you don't have that for shadow banks. You don't have that for insurance. You don't have that for private credit, which means more taxpayer money. And this is, I think, this is a worrying sequence because you're right. A whole city flooded or worse, of course you would step in. So the question is not to get there. There needs to be, closer regulation of whether risk is appropriately priced in. Environmental risk. And that's exactly what you're beginning to see in, company reporting, insurance company reporting.
Yeah, because in a way, with the reaction to COVID, we saw people's income's just guaranteed and a lot of money entering the system in ways. And then we see a massive spike in inflation afterwards, which I know has to do with Russia and other external factors, but money printing must factor into the inflation. And it's like the knock-on consequences of that support can be just as devastating, for people's lives.
Yeah, I think so. I ended the book, the last crash. Oh my God, I just could not finish this book because it was just coming. It was like then Russia invades Ukraine. I was like, oh, that's another crash. I need to write about it. And then I had to kind of draw the line. I generally group these as cost of living crisis. And yes, I write about different, factors. And the cost of living crisis, the most miserable part. I mean, there's something called a misery index because economists are such cheery people, which is it's a combination of inflation and unemployment. So if inflation is high, the economy is probably not doing well. So unemployment is probably going to go up. So you have both going up. It's pretty miserable. So again, remember, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So what we had in the cost of living crisis, thankfully, is that unemployment didn't really go up, but inflation went up to double digits in this country, over 11%. That absolutely is miserable. And there's lots of different, factors that I write about. And I think but I think what, as we're sitting here now, the global shocks that have contributed to it have begun to fade. I don't want to knock on wood because this is a podcast and it will affect the microphone. But the reason I was worried about what's happening now in the Middle East, you talked about the Suez Canal, you can see how a blockage could generate a price, inflation shock. And so I think that adds on to, all the challenges. You mentioned there, money printing, lots of fiscal borrowing. All of these things are inherently quite, could be quite inflationary. But the big driver of this stagflation we've been living through, where the economy is stagnant and inflation is high, is another lesson from history, which is what I write about, the 1970s. I mean, that is just miserable. So I'm fingers crossed that what's currently happening in the Middle East doesn't generate another massive shock, because we have seen that happen in history. So I mentioned the 1970s. In 1973 was the first global supply shock driven by oil prices due to the Yom Kippur War. And the Israel-Hamas war that we currently see is almost 50 years to the day of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. So far, because history, remember, it doesn't repeat itself, it hasn't had that impact. But if you look at the knock-on effects in the Middle East, so, the Iranian-backed Houthis who are lobbing, missiles into, ships that are going by, that kind of spread makes me quite worried, about another shock causing the cost of living crisis to worsen again, because people are still working that through. Interest rates are still high. There's a lot of consequences from these things. So anyways, that's why I did just, pen down on the book and was like, okay, yeah, I know there's going to be more, but this is it. Got to send this one off.
It must have sent you under studying all these crashes. Did you come out a bit the other side optimistic about the world, or were you thinking?
I find learning from history to be, fascinating. I mean, I find myself, reading more and more and thinking, I got to write something down. But I think one of the things that I took away, in addition to, thinking about the epilogue in a slightly different way around the Great Reset, is that I do think about how, people before us have come through some pretty horrendous times and they got through it. And I always hope that we can learn the lessons and place things into context so that, we can learn from history and not repeat those mistakes, and, and we will come through it. So that's actually what I took away. And actually one other lesson I took away is I mentioned that the 50s and 60s were the golden age of growth. That was the height of the Cold War. So when you look at tensions in the world today, the 50s and 60s had the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, nuclear weapons, poison. I mean, and yet that was the strongest period of income growth for average people and no major crashes. And so I sort of sit back and sometimes think, yes, our challenges today are formidable. However, if you look back at history, you can see what's possible.
So Damo, I hear you've got a little surprise for me.
I have actually, you don't know about this, but I've ordered you a little little screen for notes on the desk.
Big in the game.
Yeah, that little iPad mini.
It's the best boss ever. 21st century moving.
Yeah,
Your iPad mini.
so you can actually ask some questions.
Can I have some stats written down nicely?
Yeah. But that isn't really what we want to talk about.
What is it?
What we want to talk about is the fact that we're going to be partnering up with some financial advisors, people that have been on the podcast, to offer anyone who wants them one-on-one coaching and guidance sessions potentially.
Oh, so I can ask my big money questions to someone who's actually a financial advisor, not just a random geezer in his attic in North England.
Yeah, because I haven't got a clue. One of the problems that we face all the time is people email us questions that are clearly, they're like, I know you can't give financial advice or tell me what to do, but could you answer this question? And we have to be really careful because we're not authorised and regulated to have those conversations. And what we often end up doing is just ignoring them. We want to solve that problem because a podcast is one to many. We sit here, have a conversation, and that's useful. But we know that there's thousands of people that want to ask specific questions to people who are qualified to answer them.
So it's not financial advice?
It's not financial advice, no. It would be guidance, but it's from financial advisors, if that makes sense, rather than me sitting here saying, I'm going to do it, because I don't think that that's necessarily appropriate.
Yeah. So is it a flat fee?
Yes, it would be. It's just a flat fee for the call, and we offer a few different options of advisors.
So Damo, where can people find out more?
They can email my co-founder, Will, and the email is will@getmost.co.uk.